Hello and welcome to this episode of the National Book Festival. I'm Ron Charles. I write about books for the Washington Post, and it's my great privilege to talk today to Téa Obreht. She's the author of two celebrated novels, The Tiger's Wife and Inland. It's such a delight to meet you. Finally, I've been a huge fan of your work. Thank you for doing this today.
Thank you so much, Ron. I'm a huge fan of yours as well, and this is just such a privilege for me.
Now, you're one of a small group of highly celebrated writers who is writing in their second language. I'm thinking of Conrad and Nabokov. Can you tell me the whole story? Not the whole story, but the story of how you came to America and how you learned English and then to write in English?
Yeah, Conrad Nabokov and I were hanging out. No, I was born in the former Yugoslavia in the 80s before the war, and I think that the Yugoslav relationship to the English language is pretty intimate. You start to learn it at a relatively young age. You start to learn it at around 6 or 7, to speak it anyway, not to read or write in it necessarily, but. So I had absorbed it via Disney films. If I'm honest, my grandfather used to bring me bootleg Disney films, and I used to memorize the whole text of the film and just repeat it back phonetically like a parrot. And then when we left the former Yugoslavia, we moved to Cyprus, where I started going to British school and started learning English in a more formal setting and reading and writing it as well. So I think that sort of came along with the time that I started to read more independently, and reading wasn't a shared experience between other members of the household and myself. I would go and hide away with books, and so probably because learning English and developing a personal relationship to literature happened around the same time, I've only ever written in English. So that's my, I can read and write in Serbian, but very slowly and in a kind of haphazard way.
Okay. But learning to write and writing and speaking English are totally separate than being a storyteller. How did you start to think of yourself as, and you started pretty early, thinking of yourself as someone who is going to tell and make up stories?
That's a great question. To my mother's horror, this is something I decided at the age of 8.
Because you were supposed to be a doctor or something, right?
Totally. She had actually wanted to be a doctor, and I think she really had those aspirations for me as well. My grandfather was an aeronautical engineer, and my mother is an economist. But my grandmother was a great storyteller, and so storytelling was, it's part of the culture where I grew up. It was very much part of the family tradition, and I was an only child until the age of 15 when my brother was born. So all my formative years were spent in sort of very lonely circumstances, moving from country to country and telling myself stories with my toys, and making up words, and I think this probably contributed a lot to how I learned to understand the world, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was great fun. And so around the age of 8, I told my mom that I was going to be a writer. I had typed up this short story about a goat who has a bad day. I would, even then there were animals having a bad time in work. And my mother, the rules were that I was allowed to use the family laptop, which was this giant, hulking thing, if I wrote in English. And so I wrote her this paragraph about this a bad day for Billy Goat or whatever, and took it to her, and I was like, I'm gonna be a writer. And she was like, great, super. super. But was actually very supportive of it ever after. So there wasn't really
I'm
any other.
glad.
Thank you.
Now, your first novel, The Tiger's Wife, was published in 2010, and it's this remarkable story about a doctor trying to inoculate orphans in the Balkans. But woven through all that are these older tales about the doctor's late grandfather and the tales that he used to tell her. And like everybody else, I was bowled away by The Tiger's Wife and its structure, and particularly its lush style, which seems to ride this line between realism and fables. How did that structure come about to you?
Thank you. That's very. I'm so honored. Thank you so much. I think, it's funny. I hadn't really written about when I started learning how to write seriously in college and in my MFA. I worked on a lot of short stories that were set in like suburban America in the 1970s, because that's what we were reading. That's what we were reading, and I thought, well, this is serious literature. Like, I have to, this is what I'm meant to emulate. And as you can imagine, it felt false, and it didn't go well. The stories were sort of staid and generally terrible. And so I hadn't given myself permission to write about the Balkans ever, until I wrote this short story called The Tiger's Wife, the winter after my own grandfather passed away. And what surprised me about it was right away I felt sort of a shift between how I felt about that work and how I felt about sort of previous work I had done, which suddenly began to feel like an exercise in language rather than an exercise in storytelling and sort of an awareness of self. So I think what happened, I'd love to sort of pretend that I knew what I was doing in that first book or thereafter in any capacity. But looking back on it now, I think what happened was the necessity to explore the death of a loved one in narrative terms, sort of set the groundwork for everything that held together about that novel. It was, if it was going to be about, the Balkans, then it was going to have a certain kind of storytelling style and a certain kind of relationship between realism and mythos, because that's how we tell our stories. And it was something.
Wait a minute.
Oh, okay.
That's how we tell our stories. That's how you tell stories.
Right.
I mean, that's a really complicated thing.
Right. Yeah. That's how we from over there. Or I mean, certainly in my family and many other families I know from back home. That's sort of. Somebody had recently asked me about what the difference is between magical realism and how it's used in the American ghost story and magic and the appearance of the ghosts in Balkan stories. And I think the answer is magic and the supernatural in American storytelling tends to be anomalous, whereas in Balkan storytelling, there's just the door is open and it can come through at any time, and wow. you're sort of expecting it to come through. The idea that the devil might show up or like something strange or uncanny might happen and reframe how a character sees the world. It's just a given, and you're kind of waiting for it in the story. And wow. I think that was, at least I think so. I hope so. Yes. Otherwise, I'm just talking a bunch of nonsense.
No.
But I think that without knowing that that's what I was doing, that became the template for The Tiger's Wife, and this notion of childhood as a mythic space, a country that has fallen apart as a mythic space. It all became possible through this framework that allowed magic and the uncanny to enter and leave at will. And I think that's how it came about. I don't know if that makes sense.
That it works. It does make perfect sense, particularly if you've read the novel and you see how beautifully it's done there. Let's move to your new
I've
novel,
never read
which
the
is
novel, so.
totally unlike the previous novel. It's called Inland. It's an American Western. I didn't see that coming from you. It's in two parts along two timelines. It's a story of a prairie woman who's having a particularly harrowing day. And then there's this years-long life story of an outlaw who's being pursued by a marshal who will never give up. And it felt really new and risky. What was it like for you to take this on? A totally different country, a different place, a different mythology? I mean, you could have stayed in Europe. You could have written all your novels in Europe.
And I tried. If I'm honest, I tried. I threw away a couple. I tried to stay in Europe, but they just wouldn't have me. No. I wrote a couple of novels between the Tiger's Wife and Inland, or at least I wrote many hundreds of pages, somewhere around 1,400 between the Tiger's Wife and Inland, trying to find a recognizable trace of that necessity that I had felt when I had written The Tiger's Wife, because I do think that there are that no matter what project you do, the completion of anything shapes you, but sometimes having this intimate relationship with a book for many years changes not only who you are as a writer, but also as a person. And when a book is about to do that and play that role in your life, I think you feel it, or I certainly feel it. And I wrote a ton and didn't feel it, and was like, well, here we are at the end of the first draft, and this isn't anything. So, I think being afraid of things I didn't know, or feeling like perhaps I didn't have the right to write about the American West, was really the not the catalyst, but sort of it was definitely a kind of fire that kept me going. I felt very at home the first time I visited the West, which was very strange. And it was almost spiritual homecoming, which of course is what the whole mythos of the West is built on, right? It's this notion of like, I have journeyed for a very long time looking for things, and like, here I am, the first white man to set foot here, and like, this is all for me. And I think that however insidious it is, and however much we recognize the role of that particular mythology in shaping the way we talk and dream and write about the West, particularly from the settler lens, the stab of it was real, and that stab to me was terrifying. And as an immigrant, like I came here at the age of 12, I had never felt such a sense of home before. And I knew that I had to, that tension, that sort of crossroads between knowing history and knowing what it meant to feel something and feeling it anyway, was something that just had to be explored in the work. So wrote a Western, didn't go well, threw it in the garbage, and then found out this unbelievable true story about the United States Capitol.
That is just so bizarre. I mean, I'm sure everyone was like me when they got to the camels. They were like, "Oh, that's too much." I mean, she's making, I'll accept some things, but when she makes up camels, that's too much. And then you find out
it's real. Yeah, and it was, and they were brought over in the 1850s to serve as pack animals in the exploration of what was then called the Great American Desert. And they came over with these young men who were from the Ottoman Empire. And this to me sort of was the way into the story, because where I come from was part of the Ottoman Empire at that time too. And so the stories that were told about those men and the way that I imagined them to be were familiar to me, from sort of these myths of my own birthplace. And so that became a way, I think, for me to go into a classic Western as probably the only way I'm ever going to be able to tell an immigrant novel. I think that this is my immigrant novel. It was fascinating to get to learn about life at the time, and to sort of try to draw on, to extrapolate certain truths about the story of these people. And it ended up being fun and good for me in my soul.
I can imagine. And where did you first find out about the camels? I mean, how did you run across that story?
I heard a podcast called, I'm a fan of a podcast called Stuff You Missed in History Class. And they have a
That's
podcast.
Its real name?
It's its real name. Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. If you're a history nerd at all, like I am, it's just, there's so many great stories there about, they tie these tiny episodes and very, very specific narratives to larger histories that you do know. And they had this one episode about the Red Ghosts of Arizona. And the Red Ghost of Arizona was a true fireside yarn about two Arizona homesteading women in 1893 who come across an unidentifiable quadruped at their ranch one evening when they're alone. And they have a violent encounter with it. And the podcast then went on to tie this true story with the history of the Camel Corps. And so what moved me about it when I found out that both of these stories were true, and that, well, between us, you've read the book, so the strangest part about it, like about the ending, is also true.
It's just bizarre. It's just bizarre.
Yeah, it's wild. And I was so curious about the meeting and the emotional and psychological conditions of the participants of these two stories, and what it would have been like to be there on that night and be the participants in one half of the story, and to be the homesteading women too. And I think that curiosity was, it was just insatiable for me, and I had to find out.
Yeah, because it really does seem like the kind of thing you in particular would make up if it weren't true.
Right? I mean, yeah. I remember when I first heard it, I was at the gym, and I was like bopping along on the treadmill, and I remember I just sort of stopped cartoonishly and like slid back off the track. Because I couldn't believe it. And the story just kept getting wilder and wilder and more unbelievable. And then there's this, this ending that's like, and you know what, it turned out that, and you're like, okay. And it really felt very strange as a craftsperson of letters. It felt very strange to have the whole narrative framework of something. So to know, okay, there are going to be two storylines. One is going to feature these characters, and they're going to be on a journey of, as you said, many, many years. And one is going to feature these characters, and they're going to be hanging out in one place. And then at the end, this meeting will happen. So, what is there to make up? Well, everything else. And this turns out to be really, really fertile ground. But yeah.
Yeah. It strikes me as in your first book, you were writing about a place most Americans don't really know much about, sadly, but you do. But in your second book, you're writing about a place that we all Americans, people who've been here for a long time, know very well. It's sort of worn out territory. I mean, these myths of the American West are the most trod myths we have as Americans.
Mhm.
And for you to come along and find this bizarre footnote about camels, it just explodes it brilliantly. And I was just so impressed by the way you got in there and turned what we thought we knew into very unfamiliar territory.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate that. And you know, it's a time, I think, when America is rethinking its myths and reacquainting itself
Yes.
with the footnotes that are truer than the big, simple, comfortable myths that we've allowed ourselves to, that we've been weaned on for so long, you know. And
Right.
it was strange to discover it in this particular moment, but I felt very grateful to, and very grateful to be able to learn about this time, which I also knew about primarily from a mythical standpoint,
Right.
in this very new way, you know.
Right. Right. Could there a passage you could read from Inland for us, just to give people a flavor of the book if they haven't read it?
Sure. I picked out a passage that has to do with place. And you well, hopefully it works. It's sort of more in the traditional Western spirit. But this is Nora. This is from the point of view of Nora. She's one of the two uh, storylines in the book, and she's in close third, and she's thinking about her past with her husband when they first moved to Wyoming territory, which is actually where I am now. I'm coming to you at
Oh.
this moment in Wyoming.
I should have asked you. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes.
Oh, the Larks ended up in Cheyenne. Some years earlier, the Union Pacific had come through and left behind a Babylon maelstrom, a bilious, gray, seething wreck on the plains. Miners and gamblers and pimps, swaggering dudes who'd found themselves lesser men than they believed, all of them guts laid bare. From the tiny window of their house on Spruce Street, Nora watched the defeated shadows lurching home at dawn and felt that this must be the crux of life. Everybody blundering around in the full glare of ruination. No undertaking in Cheyenne was ever completed. Hammers sang day and night. The moment paint got it a false front, the pale blonde bones of some new joint sprang up overnight just down the road. If something looked to be nearing completion, there loomed the unspoken understanding that it would likely burn down soon enough and compel more work. Beyond town lay the twin cables of the railway and the plains, gray and snow-dregged in winter, yellow every other season, scattershot with distant, unseen forts. You could stand anywhere and look off in any direction and feel you were nowhere, and yet somehow perfectly bounded, perfectly surrounded. That was Cheyenne, nowhere, wanting nothing more than to be exactly what it was.
Wow. Very nice. It is so striking. I mean, since many of us live in big cities, huge parts of this country are still empty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where did
Sorry,
you
go ahead.
travel as you research this book? Because your book covers thousands of miles. What did you see? What did you look at? And what did you just get from books and National Geographic and films?
Great question. So very few primary. The experiment was considered a huge failure for many reasons. The camels were brought over. They were supposed to do their job, and they did their job quite brilliantly. But there were certain social dynamics that kept the experiment from being a success. One was that the U.S. Army felt really ridiculous sitting on top of these big, weird-looking not horses, and they didn't want that to be the image of the military, of the cavalry. That wasn't how it was going to go. And the smell of the camels was super unfamiliar to the mules and horses that the military traveled with. And so every time there was an encounter, the mules and horses would go nuts and flee because they were like, "What is it? Is it a predator? Like, it's just a giant goat? Like, what is it?" And so there was a lot of that going on, and quite unmanageable. And then, of course, the bigger problem of all this was that the experiment was underwritten and supported primarily by Jefferson Davis. So it went down in 1857, and then by 1861, it was no longer to be, which makes sense.
No. Yes.
And so the sources are quite there's a couple of diaries from people who were on the expedition, and then there's mostly letters about like funds, like how much will it cost to like feed these 33 camels for a month. So very boring stuff. But in the military diary of Edward Fitzgerald Beale, who was the superintendent of the expedition, there is a route that the camels took and the longitude and latitude of every camp where they stayed on their way from Fort Defiance to the shores of the Colorado River. And I traveled this route by longitude and latitude. And some of the places are inaccessible to roads, like you can't get there because they're sort of over a mountain or on private property. There are and some of the places where the Albuquerque Greyhound Station, which was amazing. You look at the map and you try to find the coordinates, and there you are at the Albuquerque Greyhound. So that was an incredible experience, and it felt I love the idea of when of having to take the journey when you write about a journey. It feels like a pilgrimage in more ways than one. And so I was in Texas, I was in New Mexico and Arizona, California, Nevada, like the whole route that they went. And then also went to the resting place of Haji Ali, who is a character in the book. They nicknamed him High Jolly because Haji Ali was so difficult to pronounce. And he was one of the cameleers who came over from the Ottoman Empire, and he is buried in Quartzsite, Arizona, under a pyramid with a camel weather vane on top.
Wow!
And yeah, it's a fun thing. It's a fun thing to stop and look at if you're ever driving that way. So.
That is amazing. And I have to ask, have you ever ridden a camel?
I have, yes. I grew up in Egypt, actually. I was when we first left the former Yugoslavia, we were first in Cyprus and then in Egypt, and so camels were sort of an everyday. They were not every day, as in not like, well, it was an everyday thing, but I mean sort of quotidian.
Okay.
And they were, you're like, quotidian means every day, Taya. Like, that's the same, it's the same thing. But they were sort of unremarkable. And whenever anybody wanted to take you on a field trip, or whenever anyone came to visit, they'd be like, let's ride camels. And so you'd sort of have to go and be like, oh, thank goodness you're here visiting. Let's ride camels again. It's real bumpy. And it's real high.
That is remarkable. That is remarkable. Well, Taya, it is such a pleasure to talk to you. Again, the book is called Inland. It is an absolutely wonderful Western, but a Western like nothing you've ever read. And I'm just so glad that I had the chance to finally meet you and talk to you about this book. And thank you very much from me and the Library of Congress and the National Book Festival.
Thank you so very, very much, Ron. This is such an honor.